All right. So at this point, you should have finished the treble clef and we're ready to start looking at our bass line. So let's switch back to our code. And you should have a program that looks something like this, where we have all of the measures represented and we are setting our tempo. And you probably encountered the rest for 2 beats that happens towards the end here. If you don't have that, go ahead and add that in now. That basically just says I'm going to rest, not actually play a note for that period of time, and should be ready to go. If we play this, it should sound very familiar. You may have noticed that rest sounded a little awkward, and that's because it's missing the underlying notes that would be coming from the bass line that really finish that off nicely. So now we're going to look at how would we play the bass line. And one of the big ideas is that this bass line is played at the same time as the treble clef line. So we want this to happen at the same time these blocks are happening. Now, we've talked about sequencing, that each one of these blocks happens one after another. So how could we potentially do 2 things at the same time? And you might be thinking, well, what if we put a block next to this set of blocks and had those 2 line up to kind of visually indicate that we want these to happen at the same time? It's a very human way of thinking about it, and absolutely that helps us realize that maybe those happen at the same time. But for the computer, what's really important for Scratch is this when green flag is clicked block, this hat block. That we added to the one stack. If we add it to the other stack, we're saying we want these 2 stacks of blocks to happen when that green flag is clicked. So this actually makes them operate in parallel. You heard a chord there at the very beginning because we played this note and this note at the same time. So what we're going to do with our bass clef is we're going to do these notes. So the first note on there is a low C. So this is our middle C. We want a low C, which means we need to slide down an octave. And this is our low C, 48. And we're going to play that one for 4 beats because this round note with an opening in it is a whole note that gets 4 beats to, or plays for 4 beats. I'm going to show you a couple other tricks. If you right-click on a block, you can actually say duplicate, which will give you a block that is identical to the block you just clicked on. Which is also going to be 4 beats. And this time we want a G, a low G. So we'll come up to here. 55 is our low G. And then after that we have a E, a low E. So I'll duplicate that one again. And we'll put this one at a low E, so 52. Then we need a G again. Now the other thing the duplicate will do, well actually let's do this last block, we'll duplicate it and then I'll show you something else that can be very handy. So here we want we're back to our 55, our G. If you look at the very next line, it is almost identical except for the last measure. The last measure we have some interesting things going on. So one of the things we can do when we duplicate, if we click on a block that has multiple blocks underneath it, we click duplicate, we will get an exact duplicate of those blocks. So this is measure 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then measure 8, we're doing some interesting stuff. So we don't necessarily need this one. Another thing you can do is if you drag a block over to the tool palette over here, the block palette, and let go of it, or a stack of blocks, it will delete them all at once. So that's a good way of getting rid of a bunch of blocks if you need to get rid of a bunch of blocks. So right now we are at this last measure where you'll notice that we have actually some chords. We have 2 notes that are intended to be played at the same time, and you can tell that because they're connected by the same staff, the same vertical line. So we're going to pick one of those to play. Let's play the one that's on the top, and it's going to be a half note. So it's going to get half as many beats. So if we come down to our music blocks and we pull out a play note, I'm going to put this underneath for the moment, and I'm going to put it at 2 beats. And the note that we want to play is going to be, again, in that lower clef. Scroll up a little bit. In that lower clef, and it is going to be a, looks like a F. Or no, sorry, F is the lower note. We're going to do a G. So that should be this one. And then the next note we're going to play is going to be a G again. So it's also 55. So we can either put in 55 or we can find it on the keyboard, and that's going to be 2 beats. We'll connect that together. So if we play this, you can see it's playing both these lines at the same time. But now in that bass clef line, we have a couple additional notes we need to play at the same time as these 2 notes. How can we do that? Well, just like we did when we played this bass line, we need another green flag. So basically, every time we want to do something in parallel, we have to add another starting block, another hat block, we call them, because they kind of look like a baseball cap. And they indicate that we're going to start doing something. We'll talk more about hat blocks a little further down the road. But for right now, we wanted to line up with these 2. But we have all of this time, 4, 8, 12, 16, all of those beats that we're not going to do anything on this line because this stack of blocks is taking care of all the notes we care about until we need to have those extra notes. So again, if we go back to our music, we have the rest, and we want to rest. So there's 2 ways we can do this. We could rest for 4 beats and just duplicate this. And this is actually a nice way of doing it because it visually lines up with these other blocks, and we can kind of see that is continuing that pattern all the way down. In fact, we can duplicate a whole stack. And we want to make sure that we rest for the same time we're playing all of these notes, and then we get to play our other two half notes, and we just duplicate these and pull them across. And we want those 2 notes to be, in this case, we're doing the top line, or sorry, the bottom line now, so that would be, or the bottom 1, which is an F. So it's 1 beneath this note, so it's a 53. And then also the next one is going to be 1 note lower than that, so it's going to be our E, which is that one. All right, if we play these again. There you heard the chords, because we had 1 extra note playing here and here that blended and meshed with those other chords. So this is kind of how we build up successive, what we call parallel computation. We're doing these things in parallel. Now, parallel computation is something that actually we often don't introduce until much later in most programming languages because it's a bit more complex. Scratch handles it much cleaner and much more in a very easy to approach way because we can very quickly see visually what we're doing. We're doing these in parallel, and it just really makes sense once you get your head around it. So this is actually a really good way to introduce parallelism to your students, to show them that we can do multiple things essentially at the same time. It's not truly at the same time, but it looks like and sounds like it to us. And we'll talk more about that down the road as well. Finally, if we get into our, another way we could have done this resting, for those of you that are more mathematically inclined, is we can actually do a calculation. So we can take, for example, this multiplication operation out of our operators and say that we know that each measure we're resting is going to be 4 beats, and we know that the number of measures we're going to have to rest before our next set of half notes is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we can multiply that 4 by 7. and we can do that multiplication here in the program, or we could do it in our head or on a sheet of paper and just write down what the product of 4 times 7 is. There are lots of different ways that we can actually write these programs, and no way is necessarily better or worse than others. They just have a different way of being written, and for some people, it may make more sense to use the math here. And for other people, it may really help them to see these visually laid out next to the corresponding measures and kind of see how those fit together. So that's really up to you as to how you want to play with that and what you want to do with that. Okay, so I will turn you loose to go ahead and finish off this song. The other thing you may want to play with is you can actually change what instruments you're using. So right now this is set to piano, and if you happen to be a music buff, you will know that the Ode to Joy was originally meant for human voices. So let's go ahead and pull this out, this one, and we can select different types of instruments, and we can do choir. So this will reflect kind of what the original intent of the song was. Also, these blocks over here, or these buttons over here, can let us zoom in and out on our blocks. As we start getting a lot of blocks, this last button is very helpful because it kind of just centers us on the blocks, and then we can zoom in and out and see kind of the full stack of the program that we're working with. And then, of course, you can use left click on the mouse and just drag around, as long as you're not on a block, and drag around the coding area so you can kind of see where you are. All right, so let's hear this with voices. All right, so you can see that's a very interesting, very fun and flavorful way of just getting the basics of programming down. So hopefully you enjoyed this, and you can do this with really any sheet music you want. This is also an interesting way for music teachers to start introducing more aspects of musical notation. For example, if you get into different time signatures, then how beats are figured out is completely different. Or you can play with different scales. For physics teachers, there's a lot to talk about here in terms of the wavelength of the sounds that you're actually producing and what makes an octave or a musical note and how those are related. So there's a lot of ways you can tie this into other disciplines as well. This is a really good embedded activity for covering a lot of interesting ground with your students. So thanks for your time, and we'll talk to you soon.